Okay, so I would like to welcome everyone to the Digital Futures World 2020 talk on biofutures. This talk will discuss questions of biological design and offer insight into our current world, our new normal, where humans have impacted the environment and life can be characterized by uncertainty, unpredictability, and constant change. The talk will also get into what this means for our future, and we talk with our guests tonight for around 1 hour. I'll be the moderator along with my colleague Andrea MaCruz. My name is Marcus Farr. I'm part of the Tongji University Digital Futures PhD program and an architecture professor at the American University of Sharjah in Dubai. I'll be moderating the talk with my colleague Andrea MaCruz, who's also part of the Tongji Digital Futures PhD program and a professor at Belas Artes and has her own biodesign studio in Sao Paulo, Brazil. To begin, we'd like to do a short introduction for our guests. We have an extremely interesting lineup of practitioners in alphabetical order. Rachel Armstrong, Annie Liu, and Claudia Pasquero. We're extremely excited to have them on this panel. And I thought that we could sort of give the guests an opportunity to say a little bit about who they are, perhaps where they come from, what their background is, rather than me reading a textual bio. So we could start with Rachel Armstrong and let Rachel talk to us about who she is and where she's from.
Hi, thank you. And I'm really glad that everyone's joining us tonight. I'm Rachel Armstrong, a professor of experimental architecture at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. I'm a visiting professor at the KU Leuven in Brussels. And I'm also a senior TED fellow. And essentially my work is characterized by design thinking as a fusion element for interdisciplinary expertise. And I've championed the field of living architecture, which materially and technologically directly engages the potency of life within spatial agendas. And I have a few books that are out, Liquid Life on Nonlinear Materiality, Soft Living Architecture, which is an alternative view of bio-informed design practice, and Experimental Architecture, in which Claudia is featured, Prototyping the Unknown Through Design-Led Research.
Fantastic. Welcome. We're very glad that you're here, Rachel.
Amazing. Hi, I'm Annie Liu. I'm currently teaching as an arts fellow at Princeton University. I'm an artist that is interdisciplinary, research-based, and I think a lot about the intersections between art, culture, and technology, particularly as they influence society and ethics. The last few years, I've had a very deep interest in biotechnology and how it impacts everything from identity construction, like with gender and sexuality, as well as the power structures in the government that kind of frame these discussions. And I'm very excited to be speaking with you all.
Welcome. We're happy that you're here as well. Claudia Pasquero.
Hi, I'm Claudia Pasquero. I'm director and co-founder of Ecology Studio in London. And I'm also an academic. I lead a lab at the Bartlett UCL in London, and I hold a professorship at Innsbruck University. My research focuses really on the intersection between biology, computation, and design, and try to understand how architecture, design, and aesthetic can have a role in the current ecological crisis. In particular, the three bodies, both academic, then in terms of design and innovation that I work with, have recently founded the Photosynthetica Consortium, which investigate how photosynthetic architecture can have an impact in remetabolizing some of the pollutant that our city produce, and transform the way we design architectural as well as urban system.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We could also certainly say much more about all of our guests. They have published widely, exhibited widely around the world, and I would encourage anyone interested in the talk that we have tonight to look further into their work, consider them to be leading thinkers in this discipline, and there's a wealth of information out there about these three designers. I'd like to start the questions now and invite my colleague Andrea MaCruz to start this special session by asking a first question to our guests.
Okay, first, thank you all for being here. I think it's a real pleasure to have you. And thank you, MaCruz, for the introduction. I think our first question is, we have been facing a lot of challenges lately related to the environment and technology. And we can't just go ignore and then these changes and go back to what our relationship to nature was years ago or even decades ago. So like before climate change, for example. So we have to recenter. And what is the trajectory moving forward, proposing a new ecology of natural or synthetic systems? I would like you to talk about that, I think, for a bit.
Maybe I can start by just talking very broadly. I think one of the things that I think a lot in terms of the power of art and the cultural sector is in reframing the kind of perceptions that we have in our relationships with nature. Even the question, what is natural? What is nature? The kind of questions that people ask nervously, like, are GMOs bad for me? Are they good for me? This kind of culture of consumption, use and dispose. I think all of those things are conversations that artists and designers can really lead the way in trying to shift the general perception. I think there are a lot of very technical issues that urgently need to be solved, but a lot of them have to do with, participatory action amongst all of us in this kind of global collaborative way. And that's one of the things that I'm very interested in. How do we shift that paradigm? How do we shift what is sexy and what we want, and like what kind of futures that we collectively imagine?
And that's really nice, yeah.
I think I'd like to answer it really through maybe an ontology of biodesign, and how, but biodesign has come to the fore as a form of practice. And it's got long-rooted traditions in the idea of working with the biological. So in order to make a transition from industrial thinking and practice, we need to somehow or other find ways of both technically and philosophically, so conceptually, moving from the way that we were thinking, let's say, that has shaped modernity and the Anthropocene, and find new ways of thinking and practice. And biodesign is really sitting in this nexus that partly has a root in organicism and systems biology. And it's also got a part ontology from biotechnology and the engineering of living systems, which became possible in the late 20th century. But it also has a wonderful relationship with bioart, which introduces an ethical dimension. And I think some of the most interesting questions that some that Annie's just raised to do with identity, what our relationship is with the non-human, are actually coming more from bioart than they are coming from the engineering and, let's call it, organicism or cybernetic systems. And I think that there's another component which is also poised on this point of convergence, and that is new materialism, which is our understanding that if we don't give the status to non-humans in the world, so that through acts of design, engagement, and the care and attention that we pay to the world around us, then we are simply at risk of re-exploiting, through new technologies, the very agents that we have damaged in the first place. So I think in terms of, going forward to an ecological future, I think we really are in this melting pot, maybe started with post-humanism in the early 90s, but we're starting to see a kind of reconfiguring, resynthesis of the relationship between the human, technology, the cyborg, and non-human agencies. And I also think that we really are poised at an age where we should be thinking about what life is. I think we need a re-interrogation of the edges of Zoe and Bios, and particularly with viruses, when they don't actually fit into any category of life. And so I think it's a very exciting time, and I think that we don't know what lies ahead, and that's why it's important to have these visions.
Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting.
So, following up on what has just been discussed by you and Rachel, my take on climate change and the changes that we are going through start from the observation that change is inherent to the planet we inhabit. We go back to Greek philosophy, and basically it was stated that nothing changed but change. So the question is not whether we can stop change, in my opinion, but is how can we deal with change? How can we interact with change and transformation that are inherent quality of the planet we inhabit? Can we establish different type of dynamic that are less disrupted and more positive, but we cannot stop change? So, and what is our tool to do so? I think design and aesthetic can actually have an incredible role, because we come from an era in which many technological innovation came about, but how these become design innovation and how these create a change and an interaction one-to-one with the environment and the planet we inhabit has not been established yet. As designer, we inherited a vision of aesthetic still from modernism, where the white surface is the paradigm. But there are other elements. Rachel mentioned non-human form of agency. And if we take this perspective, infrastructure and waste become resources. They become part of an aesthetic discourse. We can remetabolize them. Actually, pollutants per se do not exist. There is no black box such as pollutant. There is CO2, NOx, PM10, PM2.5, and for example, all our project, like for example, microalgae, like the spirulina or the porphyridium, there is a little bit less of porphyridium, can actually nurture on some of the elements we suffocate on. They are nutrients for them. So we can not use them, but create an alliances with them. Create an alliances with non-human form of intelligence, so that from this collaboration and from taking a non-anthropocentric perspective on design, we can eventually trigger a form of collective intelligence or potentially self-organization, where the planet, urban sphere and biosphere maybe will establish a different dialogue.
Yeah, really interesting.
Thanks.
Ideas of reframing, what is the natural participatory action, the ontology of biodesign, systems biology, the engineering of living systems, cyborg systems, kind of moving into the world or the possibility of custom climates within the human body, technological innovations, environmental innovation, gradients of pollution, are all really, really, I think, rich areas for explorations with these ideas. I think our second question is kind of interested in going a little bit deeper into some of these subjects, and we're really interested in talking to you about what is the current or maybe even more interesting future state of biodesign. And with that, I'm thinking of limitations. What are potential limitations that you face? What are potential liberating factors that you face or could become excited by amidst current issues relative to where we are now? And this could be technology or otherwise. I'd be really interested to hear you talk about that, and we were also interested in like what you're limited by right now in this age. What limits you? I think would be a really interesting discussion.
I mean, I can speak again from my experiences teaching and also my personal experience as an artist. I think one of the things that I found the most exciting, coming from a background that was not technical biology, coming from a design background, I'd trained in architecture, is the kind of toolkits available right now to designers that allow the barrier to entry to be lower. Like, for instance, when I was a student and I was just starting, maybe going back to like posthumanism and cybernetics, when I was a student, I was teaching myself how to code and build simple wearable electronics and things like that. And there were already things on the market like the Arduino, for instance, that can allow you to learn how to create these devices. But there wasn't really something like that for biology. But now there are companies like Amino and BioRealize that you can kind of buy a bioreactor. There are competitions such as iGEM, the International Genetically Engineered Machines competition, and the biodesign competition that specifically nurture and look for people outside of the discipline so that you don't need to be in a fancy multi-million-dollar laboratory in order to learn the basics and to start to co-create with other organisms, which I find to be really exciting. Yeah, I think that is one of the most exciting things. There are barriers that come with that as well. Like, I think that the same kind of barriers that plague academia in general, like there is kind of a socioeconomic barriers to entry in some of these ways. There's a lot of biohazard. A lot of artists practice in DIY biolabs that get a lot of scrutiny because of the lack of public awareness about how to mitigate the dangers. But for me, empowering people to participate actively is a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that for me, let's say the challenge is how do we undo a dysfunctional relationship with nature? And for that, I think the issue of, first of all, how do we configure ourselves, not as the center of the universe, but actually in a kind of a horizontal power relationship with other beings. But with that, we have to surrender something, which is control. And we don't necessarily feel easy about that. I think we have to accept a degree of semi-permeability that organisms like the microbiome are not only moving in and out of us, but they are part of us. And I think that this whole issue of identity that Annie raised is really at the heart of this. You know, if 8% of our DNA is viral, I mean, what exactly is the pure human in this? I mean, does that notion of humanity that we so dearly cling to actually exist anymore? And so I think that there is a kind of a fundamental philosophy for which I think is in the process of unfolding through these different perspectives articulated through the principles of new materialism. So Karen Barad, looking at the interactions of matter, Jane Bennett looking at the kind of the power of things, Haraway, obviously, looking at the politics of an agency of matter as a being, through these notions of cyborg, part fiction. So I think that we haven't got yet a single coherent philosophy of life. I'm not sure that we will, and I'm not sure that we want that. And I think that that is part of the challenge, because leading on from that then is about the forms of communication. How do I start to communicate with microbes on a horizontal platform, so work like Bonnie Basler's been doing, identifying microbial languages, showing that they have a degree of sophistication that rivals human languages in the sense, and even our interspecies languages. I mean, microbes are absolutely incredible. So how do we actually start to set up dialogues with, let's say, the non-human? How do we actually also develop the ethics that allows us to make appropriate decisions? So this, I don't think, is a free-for-all for all non-human agents to now come and reduce the status of humans. It's about how do we as humans increase the value of the non-humans in our world, and how do we make space for them? How do we design along with them? And how do we actually draw limits on this? Because it is important, almost like an immune system, where we actually start to establish boundaries and say no, and have a diplomatic engagement. It doesn't mean that every conversation with the microbe is going to be easy. We may profoundly disagree with them. So, I mean, diplomacy on human terms is difficult, as we're seeing in the world right now. So, a kind of a multi-species diplomacy, I think, is going to be a stumbling block. As we surrender a certain degree of power, we want to extend influence. So, how we're going to do that, I think, is part of the challenge. And I think that the ethics of the more than human, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa's notion of, the autobiopolitics, the new power relations, taking care of, Joan Trento, and also in terms of very practical things, the infrastructure. The infrastructure that we surround ourselves with is conducive with a machine-based world, not a world that supports life, which is wetter and softer and more mutable than what we're comfortable designing. And I think also we have issues, when we're dealing with the non-human, scale and time, because they are entangled. A microbial lifetime is much shorter than a human lifetime, but we may have many lifetimes that make up ourselves, including genetic lifetimes. And so I think there are some new concepts that emerge with the idea of an ecological framing of all kinds of practices, whose answers we actually don't know yet, and it's a journey we're yet to take.
Very interesting, I guess. Very, very interesting.
I do share the remark of Rachel, the initial remark, because then the conversation evolved. I share also the other, but I want to start from the initial remark that the main issue that we are probably facing is cultural, and with that, the whole infrastructure that we have built in the past, let's say 100 years, which is very much framed in the cultural as well as technological paradigm that we inherit from the first industrial revolution. And to change all of this, it's what is mainly problematic. So we are not used to think city as a living organism. We are not used to think about architectural system as something that we cultivate, but it's something that needs to be static. And we are used to think about object, if we go in a transcoded manner from the city to the object, as something that we purchase and then we dispose. So that is something that we need to radically change if we imagine city as living organisms, because it's not about zoning anymore, it's about understanding how multiple systems are interrelated, and also how the aesthetic of the infrastructure is rethought and infrastructure become part of the inhabitable unit. So the inhabitable unit become productive. At the same time, if the inhabitable unit becomes productive, we all need to start to cultivate and deal with this change. Part of our window might melt. Part of our furniture might be made of bacterial cellulose that I have here. This incredibly lasted 4 years. I would never expect that. But I would imagine, the base bioplastic of microbial cellulose for indoor to last less. But that is something that can be built in. We can start to interact with, transform material. But is a process that as a designer we need to design in, I think. and understand how it can be tuned. Otherwise, this type of transformation will become very difficult, and we don't want this to be a transformation that remains part of an academic debate. We want it to have an impact, and to do so, I think there is a big transformation of the production system that needs to happen. And that's, for me, the most difficult point, because I really believe in this and I try to apply it step by step. I believe in practice-based research, so in research that try to actualize at the product level, at the city level, at the architectural level, bit by bit, the point that are being researched upon. But sometimes it becomes extremely difficult when you meet the production of architecture and the structure, the construction system. So there are rules that need to be changed. And actually, if there is, I really don't like the crisis created by this virus, or I love virus, but there is one good thing that emerge from this crisis is the fact that we realize that if something dramatic happens, actually habits can change radically. So I'm for smooth transformation, but I'm starting to think we need some radical one as well to be able to change the way we produce.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, so moving on, we were talking today about how technology can be code in some ways. So in that sense, how biodesign can present an opportunity to humanize our built environment, and how can it play a transformational role?
I guess I wanted to start first by saying that I'm such a fan of this group of women, like everything. I think Rachel and Claudia say inside, I'm like, yes, like this is what I live and breathe and believe. And, you know, like, I totally don't identify as Homo sapien. I identify as complex microbiome, envirome, like, and if everyone can decenter their ego like this, you know, how will we live? And this question that you just brought up, I thought it was so interesting that you called technology cold, or maybe my speaker was wrong, but this is something I think about a lot, because I think a lot about how to democratize learning STEM for women and girls. And I think that the way we have historically taught science and technology and engineering tends to be cold, right? But actually, like, growing a garden is full of science. There are so many ways, like Claudia is showing us her spirulina, right? Like, that is also living, breathing science and technology, and it's not cold at all. And I think either Rachel or Claudia was talking about the wet and the sticky. I think it's a shift in the way we relate to technology, I think. And I think about the history of technology being gendered too, you know, like when it did split off. I think that women have played very instrumental roles in the beginning of computation and the development of computers, and then it's since split. So again, not to kind of like go back on it so often, but I think it is so much a cultural shift in how we think of these systems. And actually, as everyone was talking, I was thinking to myself again, wow, how damaging was, in some aspects, the history of modernism in dictating the tastes that we have for architecture. You know, like, that is, in many ways, these are the things that I think we have to slowly divorce ourselves from. Like, there was so much technology that went into kind of building these ribbon windows and flat roofs and all of these things that don't necessarily make sense. So I guess what I'm trying to say is technology doesn't have to be cold or rigid in these ways, and how can we relate to them in different ways? Yeah.
And Annie, how do you think, like, with biodesign, that relation could be increased or changed? Because I think that biodesign can help us a lot in that.
So with biodesign, it's so interesting. So for the last 2 years, I've been a judge in this competition called the Biodesign Challenge. It's run by Dan Grushkin and an amazing team of people. And what I find so interesting about it is when designers come to the table, they bring in other kinds of interests beyond, this is why I love interdisciplinary thinking and collaboration, because I think that a specific type of engineer might frame the problem in it, or even calling it framing a problem is already a kind of mentality that you have. Whereas sometimes some of the teams talk about, and that, but how does it smell? You know, like, how does this make me feel? And what is the multiple life cycles? What makes it desirable? It's interesting because I feel like when I was at MIT for a long time, very few engineers would talk about things like beauty. Beauty, I think, was an attribute that would be delegated as maybe excessive or something. But I've been thinking a lot about the function of beauty and how these things can coexist in systems that are not just purely functional. And so for me, at least, I put a lot of weight on the emotional. I think that's also another stream that I have explored often and think about, like this kind of bifurcation of the rational versus the emotional, whereas the emotional is another system of information that dictates how we know about the world, and is very important to fold into our notion of intelligence. So I think I've already forgotten your original question, but I think these are some of the ways that I think it's interesting for designers to fold into biodesign, to bring in the expertise and the knowledge that designers and architects and artists have, that I think is also very important in the way we conceive of engineering. Yeah.
Well, to add on is basically she was talking about emotional versus rational design, and I kind of struggle to fit in category, although I always end up in the bio one. I'm happy about, but I have to say it at a certain point. I struggle to fit myself in category. I feel them always constraining, but what in relationship to technology and intuition versus rationality, and as well biology, I think something that is interesting is the discourse, and has always been really relevant for me, is the discourse made by Gregory Bateson in Steps to an Ecology of Mind, where he discussed the understanding of reality as interrelation between languages that are rational languages and meta languages, which include art, love, and all the other forms of meta communication that humans are capable of, but as well as non-human. And he states at a certain point that without the collaboration between language and meta language, human will not be able to understand the world. And he says that, well, this is not to attack science or that saying that science is not relevant. It's just to say the traditional scientific reading of reality, as it was when he wrote the book last century, it was just a partial understanding of reality. So reality can be described mathematically, can be described to a drawing, to a song in human terms, through a painting. No one of these understanding of reality is more true than another one. But without all of them, we are unable as humans to comprehend reality. Moreover, meta languages are the languages that non-human mostly use to communicate. So famously, Bateson was describing how the embryo communicate with the womb where is embedded. And if you look at the way the communication happen, is basically a computational system. So there are fields that goes out, there are information, field that goes in. And depending from this sort of chat, which is material computation, then the embryo evolve in a different manner. So the question is, design is a meta language. So maybe we can not invent necessarily new technology or new biotechnology, but and not necessarily make them prettier, but develop an aesthetic that allow them to use them differently or to embed them more in a socio-ecological context. So transform what eventually technologies in design technique or design innovation that allow us to open up the conversation with other humans as well as non-human.
I think one of the interesting things that you mentioned was to humanize our environment. And I think that one of the things that has stepped out of the COVID-19 crisis is that I think we've marked the end of human inhabitation, and we're looking at the age of more than human inhabitation, and we're seeing the technology of the microbial unleashed on our urban spaces as the microbiome of the built environment. And there's no point in waging a war against these microbes, which we have done in the reign of hygiene, and Emmanuel Macron, announced, because microbes are also part of us. So I think there's a complete reconfiguring of the strategy of what exactly technology is, what exactly it is that we're trying to achieve by this great leveling. Really we're asking a reconfiguring of co-inhabitation and co-constituting our living spaces for the more than human realm. So I think COVID-19 has really woken us up in terms of how we organize the world, and we cannot keep on putting only humans at the center of it.
Yeah. So design could be something that's much more dynamic than human-centered design. And really interesting comments from all of you about this question, humanizing the built environment and biodesign playing this transformational role in the process. I'm hearing many possibilities there. And I think we could go on and on with that. It'd be really interesting to explore that more. Was hearing Annie talking about this cultural shift taking place with our thinking and technology actually become a natural technology as a concept, and these ideas of meta languages or languages not used by humans are things that we really need to sort of listen to more closely. Claudia discussing the way that these languages are in a way computative or computational. Maybe not in the way that parametric designers are speaking of computation, but biologically, these are definitely understandably computative. So this language could be leveraged to understand or embed perhaps a new process, perhaps a new aesthetic, and transformation could occur in that way. Rachel is very interesting, talking about waging a war on these microbes. And the need to refigure this understanding and asking for re-understanding of this relative to living spaces, I think has a lot of potential with Andrea's original question.
And also, I think the Indians here from Brazil, they have a clear view about how humans, we are part of nature. And it's a holistic view about that. I think it's really suitable with what you're saying, Rachel, that we have to understand other ethics as well about other organisms, and as we have to rethink about ours. Yeah, it's really nice.
So I'd like to move on into some other subjects, and we'd like to talk a little bit about concepts of symbiosis. Actually, there's so much discussion in design moving into the Symbiocene and how this relates to or differs itself with the Anthropocene. And I think in some ways these terms have become commonplace, but I think they also still retain this sort of lightning rod sort of capability for discussions. And for me, like looking at these two terms, Symbiocene, obviously the Greek coming from the word companionship, and this implication of living together for mutual benefit. As an ecological term, it tends to affirm more of an interconnectedness, or we could say an interconnectedness of life and living things. And thinking about this, this interconnection sort of places this human worldview back into the community life, maybe as opposed to something like wildness, as a Hobbesian term. But I think with that as the preface to the question, question for me is a simple one, but I think could have a profound answer based on how the three of you are practicing. And that is, how does your work either fit into or respond to or relate to these concepts of either Anthropocene or moving forward symbiosis or Symbiocene?
I'm not trying to cut you off, Annie. I just I just wanted to say that I want to problematize the idea of the symbiont, because there are commensals, there are parasites, and there are a mutualism. So I think what I really want to make sure is that we're not trying to say out with the old, in with the new, but to assert that actually by making these choices, we're inviting a new set of problems that we have to work at. And I think it's the investment, engagement, the negotiated diplomacy, and kind of setting up the kinds of relationships and investing in them that we want, that I think must be at the foundation of, let's call it an era of new kinds of thinking and practice. Just so that Annie can come in, I just want to say, so in terms of my work, the idea is, so we've been working on European Union proposals and projects, so things like the Living Architecture project. We have substituted what we would call a fossil fuel burner for bioreactors of different types, and these different types of bioreactors perform different functions. So it's like a kind of microbial computation that cleans grey water and turns it into cleaned water and electricity and a range of biomasses. Within that, we've got a range of synthetic biology that can help us remove phosphate, denitrify nitrous gases that are dissolved. And so there's a whole metabolism that's going on within a building. And we've worked with Cecile B. Evans on an installation called 999 Years, 13 square meters, The Future Belongs to Ghost, which I regard as like the first post-human apartment, because the microbes can produce electricity that is generating screens that provide almost like a ghostly digital life within it. But I don't want to say that's a panacea. I mean, obviously I want people involved. And so that, that our bodily functions become part of the technical system in homes that are powered by our own waste. And that requires a kind of negotiation through rituals of hygiene. It requires us to re-socialize our behaviors within these spaces. It's a learning activity and it's an investment. So I guess, just responding to your, and I intend to kind of go on, scaling this up. So, maybe work with sewage plants and gardens and, kind of scaling into the urban. But what I don't want to say is that in a world full of microbes and more than humans, that we are without problems. There'll be different kinds of problems, and we're going to have to reconfigure ourselves as much as our world to accommodate this. But the payoff is the gradual increase in liveliness of the planet, which is the infrastructural change that we're seeking. So for me, that is the payoff for the difficulties of symbiosis and the difficulties of reconfiguring ourselves and our world.
I love that, Rachel. I love that you started off by problematizing this idea of symbiocene. Actually, I was thinking that one of the things that I think is so valuable, which sounds weird, given what I'm about to say, about being a designer and an artist, is that I feel very comfortable living in ambiguity, that I don't rush to find solutions. And I think that's something that's very difficult, it seems, for policymakers. You can see this with COVID, like the information, of course, keeps shifting because it's so new and we're learning. And how do we exist during the unknown? It's uncomfortable. I know it as humans, like we want to know. And so I think that relates to how you kind of live lightly in the world. There's a lot of unknowns, and how do you make decisions and go about your life while you're still growing, and how do you admit you're wrong, and things like this are things that I think about a lot. Actually, a piece that I was thinking about is not mine, but from J. Ray Kim. She's an artist that I think spent a year changing her own diet to make her waste more nutritious for plants. Like, she was thinking about how there's this history of us engineering plants to be tastier for us. She wanted to make herself tastier for plants. And I love this, like it turns this whole Anthropocene relationship to genetic engineering of plants on its head. And at the end, I think she made kimchi with it, which is also, fermented and a collaboration with microbes and things like that. And it's a piece that really stuck with me. some of the things that I think about in my own work that I think have been discussed already here, things like reconfiguring the idea of a self-portrait to include other species so that, again, obliterating the ego as a single entity. I've been very interested in interspecies communication. There was a year where, it sounds naive now, and so going back to like humility and knowing that I was very wrong then, was trying to design a series of things that would allow me to communicate with plants on their own kind of chemical signature level. So looking at phytohormones, I actually love that Claudia was talking about languages, because I think a lot about what a post-symbolic communication would look like in a way. And I do, like, so much of the genetic engineering work happens at the molecular level and at the metabolic level. And of course, we use symbols to kind of understand these things, but I think often about how to make these systems more intuitive, and how to kind of exist and communicate in these abstract levels. Yeah, these are things that I find very interesting in my practice.
Thank you.
Well, I like the following up. Following up on that, particularly on the point of finding solution, I remember a project in which Rachel and myself collaborate in the Tallinn Biennale, and at the time I used to have this catchphrase all the time that I would like to design not from within a problem-solving framework. And this is not because I don't want to solve a problem, but because I don't want to solve them from within a problem-solving framework. So the question is also, for me, not the fact that we cannot control or we cannot find solution, but maybe we need to find a solution of a different kind, or we need to frame things in a different way. So, for example, in the case of viruses or conditions that we are unknown, rather than finding a definitive solution, we could find tendency that can adjust, define our daily habits, have applets that allow us to map millions of daily applets so that we can map pattern. So I think that for me will be an approach that will be a way of defining, because things don't just self-organize randomly. So randomness is randomness, self-organization is self-organization. So it's got rules, but are rules that are not, a cube, they're not cage. They are about dealing with dynamics. That's why we need to work, in my opinion, with biological element and also with computation to augment the biological element to be able to deal with these dynamics and interact with them and eventually change them. So for me, it's really important that this shift in perspective, not only from the anthropocentric to non-anthropocentric, but also this shift from perspective on what we can understand, how we create different languages. Because I repeat, for me, symbiosis is not just about morphological integration. You create a conversation only when you have a certain degree of understanding. But you cannot have a total understanding of the other beings or of the planet all in one go. It's about creating an ongoing conversation, and this conversation can happen only if you sharpen the tool to be able to accept that we know something here and now, but we cannot frame reality and freeze it.
Right, and acceptance, I think, has a lot of different implications, especially when you look at government and you look at society, or just asking people
there is just one point maybe on that is, for example,
sure.
that I always found paradoxical is ecological conservation. I always often find myself in this project that are about protecting birds, protecting lakes, protecting flora, and ecological conservation. And on the start, I'm always like, how do you preserve? How do you conserve it? How do you keep it like this? It's not ecological, it's of an ecological conversation, not ecological conservation. Ecology change all the time. And the fact that, there are social systems that invade certain ecology and as part of the change. And the fact that certain ecology becomes synthetic is part of the change, but that can be positive as well. So it's really about how we establish ecological conversation more than conservation.
Yeah, I think
very
it
interesting.
brings up in society, it brings up, I think, a lot of discussions of the agency of what we do and the agency of biodesign and how it can, in some ways, transform with these non-normative solutions with people who perhaps might not be as willing to accept them as we are. We are at just about 10 minutes left. I think Andrea has one last question, and probably we'll have to wrap up the conversation after that. Andrea?
Yes, and before I just wanted to pick on something that Annie said that I thought it was interesting. And did you see that concert that they did for the plants in Barcelona now?
Yeah.
Amazing, because it's more this relation that we are searching, right? I thought it was really nice. Okay, my last question, our last question is really broad, I guess. We want to kind of discuss a little bit about the boundaries between science and design. So what you can say about that in a broad term and yeah, related to your work.
Who's gonna start?
I guess I could speak broadly again. I mean, I think I work with a lot of scientists, and people often ask me, you know, how does this work, an artist and a scientist? And I think that creativity is something that's really interesting in both domains. And again, it's so interesting, the scientific method and maybe contrasting it with my own artistic methods. I feel like in many ways, there are a lot of parallels. Like I might have certain intuitions and then I test them against the reality. And I don't know, maybe this is kind of rambling, but I think there are so many similarities and moments of intersection between science and design. I think one of the barriers that maybe some designers feel intimidated about is the specificity of the technical language. And I don't know, I guess not to be so utopian sounding, but I really encourage these kind of interdisciplinary conversations. Like when I was a student at MIT, I would try to find out what bars the synthetic biologists like to go to after work. And then I would go there and meet them and try to get like, you know, the understand what they're working on in their labs, like what are the hot topics, what are the ethical issues. And I found that just this kind of really open-minded, naive approach was really helpful for me. And I think it's so important for each discipline to have a little bit more of each, you know, like I think it's really important for scientists and technologists to seek out designers to talk to and vice versa, because we all kind of exist in this world collaboratively. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that probably all of us are disciplinary nomads in some ways, that we've all stood in the shoes of other disciplines. And I think that Isabel Stenger's notion of an ecology of practices, you know, a kind of a constructivist approach to you know, create new syntheses by the proximity of different kinds of knowledge. And I think it would be you know, disingenuous to say that design and science align. I think it's actually the tensions between them. And for me, I do feel that by standing in the shoes of another practice and trying to understand it as best as I can and dress up in its clothes to have a look at the perspectives that I can see from that position is greatly enabling. And what it possibly does render me as someone who is a bit like Karen Barad's interactions, that it is hard to find a disciplinary home once you stand in that space. Because I guess for me, the expansion of knowledge and the possible ways of approaching something starts to become interesting in itself. And so I know the term, you know, post-disciplinary is something that's used in academic discourse. I'm not really a fan of post-disciplinary because I think that disciplines in themselves provide a kind of limit, a constraint on thinking. But I do think that we're entering a synthetic age of knowledge So much more knowledge exchange and the ability to stand inside other practices to produce new work and insights. And I think from that perspective, then I think that we're no longer really occupying different disciplines. I think that we are starting to world worlds, so that we're starting to try to take the first steps into thinking holistically, not just in an abstract way, but actually finding the tools that help us connect between the disciplines so that we may be able to conjure forth those worlds and start to shape and inhabit them.
Well, for me, I'll try to be concise, but there is, I don't like boundaries, you might have understood. I like differentiation and differences though. And for me, it's a question of reframing the definition of science and design as it is. There is scientific knowledge, there is artistic knowledge, but then I would wish we overcome the disciplinary boundary between science and design, and we are more specific boundary. For example, myself, I consider to all the knowledge of biology that is very specific on myself, or knowledge of design and knowledge of computation. So of course I work academically inside of a faculty of architecture. But many of the projects that we do are on the boundary in between design and scientific innovation. And I wish in the future we could define ourselves more algorithmically. So not I'm a scientist, I'm a designer, I'm a biologist, but I don't know, I'm Claudia / Ecology Studio, and I algorithmically define myself as a percentage of science, design knowledge and computational one. Rachel, you, the same. And it's a very specific knowledge to myself that I can exchange with others because I'm different from the other. But I don't feel like fitting in very traditional disciplinary boundary that on the other hand, we invented ourselves to discuss a specific type of culture that at the moment I think is superseded. Therefore, we should define a new culture, which is able to interpolate between this real knowledge. The knowledge exists, but the professionalism can be at the intersection of those.
Perfect.
Oh.
I think yeah, really well.
Great. Yeah, really great. Unfortunately, I think that we're coming to the end of our time together. It could go on for another hour, I think easily. Incredibly interesting conversation with all of you. We'd like to thank our special guests for a great discussion this evening, Rachel Armstrong, Annie Liu, and Claudia Pasquero. I wonder, I would like to give the three of you maybe an opportunity now, just briefly to tell the audience that is live streaming on YouTube how to find more of your work, perhaps a website link, something like that, that would give people a way to go deeper into some of the things that you're saying. Rachel?
Can we provide links?
Sure.
I can't roll the www address off the tip of my tongue, but you can have a look for my books, Liquid Life, Soft Living Architecture and Experimental Architecture. But I'll provide a link if you need it.
Fantastic.
So most of our my information, both the academic and the design innovation one, are either in the website ecologystudio.com or in the one photosynthetica.co.uk. And also, if you Google my name and algae or slime mold, I'm sure you'll find out something.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, good old-fashioned Google search can yield a lot. I tried to post occasionally on Instagram at Annie Liu Studio. So
okay, great. Thank you, Annie. Well, listen, it was an extremely meaningful conversation for us. On behalf of Andrea and myself, we'd like to thank everyone personally for the articulate thoughts, the idea relative to this topic, and for most of all sharing your time with us today. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we hope that we can meet sometime soon in the physical world.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure.
You mean in the same physical space, because we are in physical space as well.
Yes, different.
I mean, some sort. Okay.
In a
good.
more touchy way. But yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And a big warm kiss from Brazil for all of you. That's it.
Thanks for the invitation. Very nice to see you all.
Yes.
It was
Very
fantastic
nice.
meeting you. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye.
ciao, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Bye, bye.